Hello everyone, my name is Edddie Bolen. I'm a pastor at two different churches. I'm a pastor at Midway United Methodist Church. I'm also a pastor at Edgewater United Methodist Church. I want to thank you so much for taking some time and for watching this video. In this video, what I want to do is I want to talk about renewal. Now, one of the interesting things about renewal and the interesting ideas about being renewed is that over this past couple of years, particularly one of the things that I've spent a lot of time in prayer about. I also spent a lot of time with leaders and tried to determine, what is this season of life that we are in? What's the kind of season of life that all of us find ourselves in? I'm not talking about fall, winter, spring, summer, but I'm talking about, what's going on? What's happening in this moment where we find ourselves in? And it seems like there's been a lot of seasons that have been forced on us lately. I know through the pandemic, as well as the Great Resignation, and through this prayer and discernment, I know it seems that we have experienced together just a lot of seasons in life that have been forced upon us. But I wonder about if we could take a moment and if we could begin to say, you know what, this is going to be a season in my life that is a season of renewal. And I don't know if you've ever thought about that or what that might look like, but that's what I want us to explore in this video, as well as I'm going to be posting a few other videos to talk about what does the season of renewal look like in our lives. Renewal is something that comes from the scriptures, something that comes from the New Testament of the Bible, particularly Romans chapter 12, verse 2 says this, that we are all called to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. According to the scriptures, renewal, and if we want to walk into that season of renewal, it begins in our heads. It begins in our minds. Something a lot of neuropsychologists will remind us as well, that a lot of times when we want to pursue renewal in our lives, and not only neuropsychologists, but just plain psychologists would tell us that too, that it starts in our minds. It starts with our thinking. And in all those times when you have considered renewing your life, and all those times that you've considered renewing your relationships, or maybe even if you've taken a moment and said, you know what, I'd really like to renew the kind of work that I'm in. I think that a lot of us find ourselves right there right now too, is that thinking about, is this really the kind of work that I want to be involved in? But have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought that as you try to renew maybe an aspect of your work life, maybe an aspect of your home life, maybe you try to renew even some relationships that you have in your life. Have you ever thought about that 3-pound mass of cells and neurons and synapses that resides on top of your head? Very place that we think about is our minds, and that is being our brain. It really is. That's what scientists tell us. It's about 3 pounds that sits on top of our heads. Now, for a lot of us, evidently, we are already used to spending a lot of time in our heads, spending a lot of time in our minds. Researchers have shown that on average, that an average person spends about 4 to 6 hours a day daydreaming. I mean, that's a lot of hours to imagine that we're spending 4 to 6 hours every single day daydreaming. And you may ask yourself, well, how in the world do people know this? How are researchers able to come across this and to know that we're daydreaming 4 to 6 hours a day? And probably they're daydreaming as well. There were people who, this is one of the things that researchers discovered, is that there are people that have maladaptive daydreaming, a real condition that leads people to spend 8 to 12 hours a day daydreaming. Imagine all of that time in your head. What good comes from that? I mean, those 4 to 6 hours that we're spacing out, those 4 to 6 hours that we're daydreaming, what good comes from those daydreams? What actions, what improvements do we really honestly make as a result of daydreaming? And we tell ourselves all the time that it's good to space out, it's good to have this space because we are doing those things, but really, how often do those daydreams lead to something that is good and practical in our lives? And so this is what I want to invite you to do, that if we are already used to spending this much time in our heads, is there a way that we can begin to harness this time and use it so that it might be able to lead to renewal in our lives? Well, the answer is yes. It means becoming devoted to renewal and becoming serious about renewing our minds. What if we took our minds? This is what I want to invite you to consider. That what if we took our minds, a place where we already are quite comfortable spending all of this time in, and what if we begin to allow God to renew the place where all those cells and those neurons interact on top of our heads? Well, it's not going to be easy. because it's not something that comes automatically to any single one of us. God has created all of us to not only be people who are logical and reasonable and even people who are thoughtful, but God has created us to be able to do this, to have lives that not only experience renewal, but we can be transformed. But this is what we're doing. Before we get ahead of ourselves, we are going to focus on renewing. But the scriptures remind us that God's created us so that we can actually transform our lives. This is what will lead to change. But before then, I want us to focus on renewal, that we can be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Now, a little background on these words that come in the 12th chapter of the Gospel of Romans. That's Gospel of Romans, a letter to Romans. Well, in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, a little background on this is that these words come from the Apostle Paul, who was writing about 57 years after the birth of Jesus in the Common Era. And Paul writes this entire letter of Romans with a certain orientation, just to be quite clear, a certain predisposition that Paul has when he's writing this, because Paul describes two lives. He describes two kinds of lives. That there is a life in the Spirit with God, and then there is also a life in the flesh that is apart from God. So that's the orientation, that's the presupposition that Paul brings when he is writing this letter to the Romans. And I want to start in our own life of renewal with an emphasis that Paul makes at the very beginning of the letter of Romans, because Paul says this kind of divided life, this life in the Spirit, this life in the flesh, this life with God, this life apart from God, which is what he describes. He says it's not always been this way. Romans chapter 1, verse 20 says this. This is from a translation called the New Living Translation. Because of what God has done in creating us and the earth, that's all of us as human beings. Because of what God has done in creating us and the earth, for ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and we've seen the sky. I will tell you on this day is a beautiful sky that is there. But through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, that is of God, his eternal power, also God's divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. You see, for all of us, there's no excuse for not knowing God. And as difficult as it may seem at times, there is no excuse for not experiencing transformation in our lives by the renewal of our minds. And you may say, but, really, you don't know my life. And that's exactly true. I don't know exactly where you're sitting at in this moment. I don't know the kind of experiences that you've had here. I don't know what you've been through. I don't know if you have moments or instances that have felt. Well, the Apostle Paul, in the 7th chapter of the book of Romans, will talk about his own experiences. And I don't know if these resound with you, but I know in a lot of ways they resound with where I'm at and with my life. But this is what Paul writes. This is Romans chapter 7. It's 18 through 23. This is from a translation of the Bible called The Message. I obviously need help, Paul says. I realize that I don't have what it takes. I've been there before too. I can will it, but I can't do it. I decide to do good, but I don't really do it. I decide not to do bad, but then I do it anyway. My decisions, such as they are, they don't really result in actions. Something has gone wrong deep within me and gets the better of me every time. It happens so regularly that it's predictable. You see, one of the things about our lives is that they flow from who we are. They also flow out of the experiences, both good experiences as well as the negative experiences. All those experiences that we've had. And also, that's what flows into the lives that we're living right now. Our actions in our lives, how we actually live, are determined by where we find ourselves, the season of life that we find ourselves in, how we're telling the story of our lives in this moment, and how we find ourselves in our minds. Again, that 3-pound thing that we carry around with us on the top of our heads, our brains, our minds, really factor into that a lot, because before we take a step, before we take an action, before we move into action, before we do it, we think it. And this is precisely why the Apostle Paul will remind us that in getting at these words, that it's not willpower, it's not strength that we kind of muster up together, but there's more to it than that. And not only that, but Paul will describe it and says, this is as damaging as a war. There's destruction, there's casualties. How many times have you felt like there was a war that was going on within your own body? Or what about your life? Wanting to do good and not doing it? And if it's not strength, if it's not self-control, then what hope do we have? Well, the hope that we have is being renewed in our minds. That's the hope that we have. And I want you to do something. I want you to try something. I want you to fold your hands together. My papers are going to start. Oh, I'll slide them right there. I want you to do this. I want you to take your fingers, put your knuckles together, and just fold them together like this. This really is, believe it or not, this is a pretty good representation that we all carry with us of our brains. Again, you know, those 3 pounds that sit on top of our heads, but that's a pretty good representation of our brains that we have. And so if we can imagine that, if we can imagine, you know, our brains that are right there in front of us, I want you to go a little bit deeper and think about this, that below the surface of our brains, but on the surface there are cells. Remember from biology, there are cells that make up this. And these brain cells, they become active and they communicate with neurons. So those brain cells, they become active and they communicate with neurons. It's the very reason that we are able to hold our hands together. It's also the very reason that we're able to stand up. We're able to sit down, we're able to eat, we're able to breathe. You can probably start to fill in the blank. You start to get the picture of our brains that we have. Now, these brain cells communicating with our neurons, they travel down pathways that are called synapses. And the whole process, what it does is it creates a neural pathway. It all happens inside our brains. Now, over time, those neural pathways create grooves in our brains that they even show up on MRI scans. You can see them. You can see that's what they're doing. They're creating these grooves in our brains. And our minds are very efficient at creating those neural pathways, especially like the ones of being able to close our hand, putting, you know, making a fist like that, putting it together. And most definitely those neural pathways that are involved in us standing up, sitting down, eating, breathing, the very strong grooves. And because our brains essentially want to become as efficient as possible in doing that, and even being able to grasp my papers right there, I've got very well developed neural pathways that enable me to do that. So I can do it as efficiently right now as you're seeing on this video. But groove after groove is established in our minds. I don't think I had to keep going over that. It's a really neat process, but it's very simple. Not simplistic at all, but it's extremely simple the way that happens. But even those things that move us away from renewal, the bad that we find ourselves doing, even when we want to do good, there are grooves in our brains that are wiring that bad behavior in our minds. A bit more plainly, Paul says it like this. He says, I decide to do good, but I don't really do it. I decide not to do bad, but then I do it anyway. And then Paul says, my decisions, such as they are, they don't result in actions. Something has gone wrong deep within me and gets the better of me every time. Romans 7:18 and 19. And this is actually the biology behind bad habits, both good and bad, of how those habits are formed, how they become part of our lives. And research in neural pathways is why the University of College of London was able to say that for an average person that it takes around 66 days to really form a new habit. And in fact, after 66 days of doing something over and over, after 66 days, it's not only a habit, but it actually becomes automatic behavior. Because these grooves, these neural pathways that are established in our minds, they just become deeper and deeper and deeper, and then we don't even think about it anymore. They just become automatic behavior, which is why in the year 2020, that particular season of life, and it's a season that all of us will experience together, but this is exactly why in the year 2020 that many of us discovered that we were not oftentimes doing the good. Many of us discovered that there were bad habits that were set up then because we spent more than 66 days isolated. We spent more than 66 days quarantined and socially distanced, just enough time for bad habits to move from just occasional acts to full-blown automatic behavior. Paul, who also experienced his own quarantine and solitary confinement in a Roman prison cell, he begins to ask what I think many of us ask at times. This is from Romans chapter 7, verse 24. I've tried everything and nothing seems to help. I'm at the end of my rope. Is there no one who can do anything for me? And isn't that the real question? This is what Paul says. Isn't that the real question? Isn't there anyone that can do anything for me? Well, there is an answer. A way to renew our minds, a pathway to removing bad habits, but also a pathway of removing sin, which consists of bad habits that actually have the ability to kill every single one of us. Well, the answer, Paul says, much more plainly than I could say it, the answer, thank God, is that Jesus Christ can and does. He acted to set things right in this life of contradictions, where I want to serve God with all my heart and all my mind, but I am pulled by the influence of sin to do something totally different. And so what I want to do is I want to invite you to take one step toward renewing your mind this week. At least a couple times a day, at least 2 times a day. Take a moment, and it may not seem easy. It may not seem like automatic behavior, but what we're going to do is we're going to be, again, establishing it into a new habit, into some automatic behavior. I want you to think about that at least 2 times a day, to say, I'm renewing my mind. To think about things that are filled with renewal. Think about things that are leading to renewal. There's a little bit of help that I want to give you here too. This is from another letter that Paul writes to the Philippians. This is scripture, Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. This is going to be from a translation. It's called the New Revised Standard Version. But I want you to listen as Paul begins to sum up a thought that he has. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. This is exactly what I want you to do. I want you to begin for at least 2 times a day, a couple of times a day, over the next 7 days, over this next week, I want you to begin to think about what is true, what's honorable, what's just, what's pure, what's pleasing, what's commendable. And think about those things that are filled with excellence. And if there is anything that you can lift up in praise, if there's anything that is worthy of praise, I want you to fill your mind with that. And know that what you are doing is you are establishing a brand new neural pathway. You are creating a groove that will, over time, be able to show up on an MRI scan in your own mind and in your own brain. At least a couple of times a day, think about those things. And again, that scripture reference is from the New Testament. It's from Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, and it is the Apostle Paul who reminds us that if there is anything that is true, if there's anything that is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is commendable, if there is anything that is worthy of praise, hold it in your mind. Because in holding it in your mind, thinking upon these things, you are creating new pathways, and a pathway is being established for renewal. Well, I hope that this is helpful for you, but even more so, I hope that this is life-giving for you. I want to invite you into a season of renewal. And as we journey together in this season of renewal, I'd love to hear any questions that you have. I'd love to hear any comments. You can just post them down in the comments. You can send an email to either one of the churches, either at Midway or at Edgewater. We love to hear feedback in that sense about what you're experiencing, what you're going through. But know this, that this can be a season of renewal in your life, that this can be a time of renewal for you. It starts in our minds, and it can lead us to brand new, transformed lives. And so over these next few weeks, that's exactly what we'll be exploring. But may you all experience God's renewal in this season of renewal that we are experiencing together. Thanks again for watching. May God's blessings be upon all of you, both now and forevermore. Amen.